Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and a lot of people have asked me to do a video that shows in tremendous detail every single thing about how I quilt my quilts, the Quilt As You Go quilts that I make when I have Cuddle Fleece on the back. So that's what this video is. So here's a quilt that is all basted and ready to be quilted, and I just want to show you a couple of things about it. This has the Cuddle Fleece on the back. And as with any quilt, this is no different for Cuddle Fleece or for Quilt As You Go, you need your back to be bigger all the way around than the top of your quilt because things can shift a little bit while you quilt and you don't want the back disappearing up there. Remember, the batting is already in here. This is Quilt As You Go, so the batting is already quilted to the back side of the block. All we're doing now is adding the batting or the backing. So since I have already quilted the interior of all the blocks, all I need to do now is secure the backing to the quilt. And for that, I'm going to do very minimal quilting. I'm really just going to quilt along these seam lines between the blocks. So when I basted this quilt, I didn't worry about basting all over the inside of the blocks. I really just worried about basting along those seam lines where I'm going to be stitching. And I don't go crazy with it. I find that this doesn't really shift any more than regular fabric. So I just put a pin at each intersection and one in the middle. So it's not crazy basted all over the place. It's pretty much the way I would do any regular quilt. So people also asked about the needles and the thread that I use. So I don't use a special needle for quilting with the Cuddle Fleece. This is just a universal needle, size 80-12. This is my default needle that I use for just about everything. And I'm also not using any kind of fancy thread. This is just Coats & Clark Dual Duty. Nothing special. You can get this anywhere. I usually, if it's a quilt like this that has different colors all over the top where each block is a different color, I'll usually choose something fairly neutral for my quilting, especially if it's going to show, which this one is. This isn't the thread that we're going to use. I've already got my machine threaded with a slightly lighter shade of this very kind of grayish purple, which I think is going to look nice. Usually I'll use some shade of gray or maybe a beige. It really depends on the quilt top. So that's it as far as having everything prepped and ready to go. We're going to take it over to the machine and I'll show you how I get that set up, and then we're going to do a line of quilting. So before I turn the light on my machine, which is going to make everything kind of blinding it just makes the lighting weird. I want to show you that I do have, this is my walking foot that's built into my sewing machine, and I do have that engaged. If you don't have a dual feed foot like this, you'll definitely want to have a walking foot. It actually replaces the presser foot on your machine, but it pulls the top layer of fabric back in the same way and at the same speed as the feed dogs down here. So make sure that you have a walking foot. You definitely want to use that anytime you're quilting any kind of quilt, whether it has Cuddle Fleece on the back or whether it has just a quilting cotton. You definitely want a walking foot. So as far as any of the settings, you can do this kind of quilting. Let me pull the quilt up here so we can see it. So I'm going to be quilting just along these lines. You can do stitching in the ditch right in that seam. Sometimes I'll do a line of quilting on each side of the seam, just basically the presser foot away. And that makes kind of a nice frame. And since these guys look like they're little portraits, that looks nice. Another thing that you can do, and this is especially good for people who are worried about the bulk, even though there's not really any extra bulk here, even though you have the batting. But people who are worried about that bulk showing up after multiple washings or anything like that, you can actually do a wider stitching here. You can use a decorative stitch, you can use a zigzag stitch, and sometimes I used one on a Cars and Trucks quilt. I used one that looked like little tire tracks. You can really have fun and play with some of the decorative stitches on your machine. One thing that I am going to warn you, a zigzag stitch is the easiest to do here, and that's why I'm going to show it to you. Some of the decorative stitches, when the machine is feeding the fabric through, it moves the fabric back and forth to achieve that decorative stitch. And that can be very hard when you're working with an entire quilt up here. It can be very hard to keep that speed even when it's going back and forth. So especially if it's the first time doing this, I don't recommend doing one of the complex decorative stitches. Give it a test run with some fabric and make sure it's one that just goes consistently forward instead of a lot of back and forth. So I've got my needle that I already told you about, my thread that I already told you about. I do have, in my machine, I'm going to have a light purple thread in the top, and I've got gray thread in the bobbin so that it'll blend into the background here. You don't have to do that, but you can. As far as settings, I've just got mine on the standard zigzag stitch. I haven't adjusted the width or length of it at all. On my machine, I actually like the way it looks, just straight, you know, hit the button and it goes. One other thing just to be aware of when you're quilting with Cuddle Fleece, since this is the specific thing that we're talking here, the cut edges of the Cuddle Fleece shed like crazy. So don't wear your nicest cashmere sweater when you're doing this, because you're going to be covered with this fuzz when you're done. So just be aware of that and dress appropriately. So we're going to do a line of quilting. Just like when I quilted the individual blocks, I always start in the middle of the quilt and work from one side or another. That way I never have to fit more than half the quilt under this part, under the arm of my sewing machine. So on this one, half of the quilt is right in the middle of this block. So I'm just going to start to the side here, and I'm going to remove my first basting pin. So I get everything set up here. Lower my presser foot, and I just check and make sure nothing is hanging off, nothing is pulling any extra weight anywhere. I'm ready to go, and there's nothing bumpy under here. Everything is smooth. There's no wrinkles in either my top or in my backing underneath. And then I just start sewing. Now I'm approaching the first basting pin. I don't try and take those out while I'm sewing. I always stop. My machine stops with the needle down. If yours doesn't, just turn the hand wheel on the side until the needle is buried, and that way you don't have to worry about accidentally pulling your quilt out of place while you're taking out the pins and things. It just acts like a little hand holding it in place. And sew some more. Needle is down. I'm going to take out this next pin, and I'm just going to stop for a second and make sure, I'm going to feel with my hand under here and make sure I don't have any wrinkles, nothing, I don't have the edge of my quilt folded under there, and I'm going to catch it in the stitching, all of which I've done before. And I'm going to do the next little stretch. Just shifting these, I could feel it pulling a little bit. So this part of the quilting really isn't any different than any other full-size quilt that I'm running through my machine. I just do what they call stuff and fluff, where I don't roll up the side or anything like that. I think that makes it very cumbersome and difficult to work with. So I just make sure that what I have here isn't pulling. I've got some bulk up here so that there's no heavy weight pulling off the side. And another thing to be aware of is that the only part of your quilt that really needs to be nice and smooth is the next like 6 inches that you're sewing. So it doesn't matter that this is all wadded up. It doesn't matter that this is all wadded up. All that matters is that little section in front of your needle. And now I can feel this pulling on the corner of my table here, so I'm just going to make sure I lift that up there, and I've got a little bit of slack. Anytime you feel the weight of the quilt pulling against you, stop, needle down, and just adjust things so that there's some weight up on top of your work table instead of hanging off the side of it. Again, I'm getting hung up on that corner of that table there, so I'm just going to lift a little segment up. Yep, that's still smooth under there. I'm almost to the end. Get this weight up. You need to also make sure as you're doing this that you have enough room on the back side of your machine for your quilt to pile up while you're working. You don't want your quilt to hit a traffic jam where it won't flow off the back because you've got no room for it. And last pin. So I sew right off the edge basically, and then just let you look in here. So this just makes kind of a little frame around each block. I like the width. I like being able to see that little bit of extra stitching, that extra detail of it. And it really is fun to use some of the more elaborate decorative stitches in there. Just don't do it for your first one. So again, I'm going to work from this row. I'll then work out to this next row, and then I'm off the edge of this quilt. And then I'm going to turn the entire quilt around and go back to the middle and work my way on the other side of the quilt. And then I'm going to turn it halfway and do all of the horizontal seams. Again, starting in the middle and working from one side to the next side. Always start from the middle and work your way out. And really, it's just like sewing, just like quilting any other quilt. So a couple of people asked me to show what that quilting looks like on the back of the quilt with the Cuddle Fleece, and I just want to show that to you here. If you pull the fleece apart, you can see that zigzag stitch in there, but really the pile of the Cuddle Fleece tends to hide it, and it just looks kind of a thick line, just like a little groove going down your quilt. So it's very subtle, and it stays nice and smooth. The Cuddle Fleece really doesn't stretch or distort at all. I've never had any problems with it. I really just treat it like any other quilt. So that's it. Really, in a lot of ways, it's just like quilting any other quilt. I don't find that the Cuddle Fleece causes any particular problems. It doesn't stretch, it doesn't distort, it doesn't act weird. It just behaves like any other fabric. The only thing it does is make a total mess of your clothes while you're working on it. When you're done, trim up the edges, trim away the excess backing, put on your binding, whatever kind of binding method you choose. I use the same method I use for any of my other quilts, and I'll pop a link in here to that video. But it makes a really nice, cuddly, soft quilt with a really nice, comfortable weight to it. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.